Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invite to speak this afternoon. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to be here at this webinar. For the continuing education folks, do hang on till the end. I promise I'll try and make it worth your while. So the title of my talk, is a little sensationalist. It came from the Black Lagoon that conjures images of, fearsome swamp creatures, things lurking in the water. And, there are some species that, like the sea lamprey on this title slide I have, that really do kind of invoke that spooky, scary idea of, an invader coming into our ecosystems. But what I hope to talk to you and, maybe convince you by the end of my talk is that invasive species come in all different shapes and sizes when we're thinking about the types of species that are in our rivers, lakes, and wetlands. And it really is, it's one of, I would say, the biggest challenges facing our freshwater resources in the state of Illinois, but it also presents a lot of opportunities for work and for ensuring that we protect these freshwater resources for the future. So I don't need to tell this group twice, the healthy streams, wetlands, lakes, and ponds that we all really love that you were sharing in the chat provide so many benefits to us here in Illinois. Everything from supporting biodiversity, so ensuring that we have lots of different species of plants and animals, to providing irrigation for agriculture, to just being a place to enjoy and have recreation, to go fishing on a summer day or to go kayaking. And so when these streams and wetlands and lakes are healthy, they're awesome. They're providing us tons of benefits. But as I kind of already alluded to, our waters do face a whole host of different challenges. And that's everything from pollution, whether that's, things like plastics in the water, dumping of different chemicals or things like heavy metals. They also face just like the loss of habitat over time, whether a wetland has been drained to be used for agriculture, development of, more urbanization, wetlands in particular, and I'm a wetland biologist by trade, so I will tend to lean towards the wetland side of things, but wetlands are, really stressed in terms of habitat loss. And you have these big challenges, pollution, habitat loss, and then we introduce kind of a third stressor, which is this idea of invasive species. The one I've put up here is just one. It's probably one of the more famous ones that you know about, the invasive carp. I'll talk about those in a lot more detail throughout this webinar. But invasive species like the carps are kind of one aspect of a whole host of challenges that face our freshwater ecosystems. And so to give you just a quick roadmap to what I hope to talk to you about today, I'm going to start with kind of an Aquatic Invasive Species 101, just to get us all on the same page about what we mean when we're talking about invasive species, how invasive species get to new water bodies, what kind of damage do they cause, the basics. Then I want to get into what I call the unusual suspects. So these are a mix of species that get a lot of press, such as the invasive carp, and then species that, aren't as commonly seen in the press, or I want to say popularity, but more like infamy, but can still have and still cause some ecological harm. And then finally, we'll wrap up with how you can help, both you individually, how different organizations can help, some of the research and outreach that's happening around aquatic invasive species in the state of Illinois. So first, I want to just introduce some terminology. The image you see up on the screen is one that you might come across, especially if you're interested in things happening in the Great Lakes. And it is this really, and it's almost meant to feel overwhelming. It's this really complex thing. You know, we have over 180 non-native species established in the Great Lakes. And that sounds super frightening overall. You're like, oh my gosh, we have over 180 species in the Great Lakes, non-native. But what's important to kind of tease out of that is not all of those species are necessarily invasive. So what do I mean by that? A species can be non-native but established, which means it's non-native and it has reproducing populations. If that species that is both non-native and it has reproducing populations, so it's established, if that species also causes harm, whether that's environmental harm or economic harm to humans, then we consider it invasive. So there's a somewhat of an, language, there's somewhat of an element of language when we're talking about, what's a non-native species versus an invasive versus non-indigenous. There's a lot of terms that get thrown around, but for purposes of this talk, when I'm talking about invasive species, I'm talking about those that are non-native and they cause harm. So of this big figure where we show over 180 species that are established in the Great Lakes, not all of them necessarily cause significant ecological or environmental harm. In some cases that actually, it takes time. Sometimes a species will become established and it doesn't seem to cause harm for a while, but then conditions change and it does become harm. It, is able to proliferate a lot more easily. And so there can be some, challenges. That's why we do a lot of monitoring to see these species, but it's also kind of important to acknowledge that when we are talking about invasive species, it's not just invasive fish like the carp, it's everything from plants, invertebrates such as clams, mollusks, to even things like bacteria. If you're an angler, you may have heard of a disease called VHS, which is the viral hemorrhagic, I believe, syndrome, a disease in fish. And that is also considered somewhat an invasive species, even though it is a disease. So very broad umbrella term is the take-home message there. And so this is less terminology, but just for the rest of my talk, when I'm going to focus today, obviously, on aquatic invasive species, which I will refer to as AIS. So now we've laid the groundwork of some terminology. Let's talk about why we care. Why am I giving you this talk today about AIS? And as we said, an invasive species is one that causes harm. And in some cases, an invasive species causes harm because it outcompetes native species. This is often the case because invasive species can grow really rapidly, they reproduce really prolifically, they can tolerate a whole host of environmental conditions. And so with all those features put together, you have something that's well placed to outcompete native species. Different types of aquatic invasive species can actually alter the landscape around them too. Things like Phragmites, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is the common reed, that can really alter the landscape and even cut off access to different habitats for fish species, reduce habitat for birds, etc. So they can have pretty big impacts on the landscape. This is one that some of you may be familiar with, like if you have gone on a lake or a pond and you have some kind of invasive plant that's taken over, it can actually lead to it can impede transportation. It can impede like your boat on that lake. And kind of along those same lines, that can eventually lead to impacts in recreation, not to mention things like power generation, fishing opportunities, a whole host of impacts. And as a very, very low estimate, there was a report that came out a couple of years ago trying to just quantify the economic harm that AIS caused to the Great Lakes states. And they said, as a very low estimate, it's at over $100 million annually for the Great Lakes states, is the cumulative cost of all of these different ecological and economic harms. And as I stressed, this is a very low estimate because we have so many industries around the Great Lakes, from the fishing industries to lakefront property owners. There are so many different stakeholders that this is a very kind of conservative estimate. But needless to say, that's still a very significant amount that is of cost to Great Lakes states from these AIS. And so how do AIS, or how do any invasive species get to new places, is always a question we as scientists want to know, and managers want to know, because that can help understand how we can prevent them from getting to new water bodies. And there's really two kind of groups that I think about when I think about how invasive species move. That's intentional movement of the invasive species and unintentional. And so I'll give a couple of examples of what I mean by both. So intentional pathways that invasive species can get to new water bodies are, if they're introduced as a potential food source, things like aquaculture releases. Unfortunately, it's kind of the Finding Nemo effect. There's also the idea, if you release a pet into the wild, such as this goldfish you can see on the screen, they can not only live and survive, but reproduce, establish those populations, and then cause harm. And then there's also the intentional, use of non-native species in, say, like water gardens, where they can, kind of grow out of control and spread to new places. So we have sort of this intentional group of pathways, but really with AIS, and what makes them so hard to prevent and manage, is there are so many unintentional ways that they get to new places. And when I say unintentional, what we're really thinking about are things like hitchhikers. And hitchhiking is such another broad term, because it's everything from, when you take your boat out of a lake and you've got some aquatic plants on it, you may have little larvae of invasive species, and say then you take your boat to another lake that doesn't have that invasive species, you could potentially transport it. And in the case of the larvae, you wouldn't even know because they're microscopic. But hitchhiking also can be invasive species that come in shipments of native species. So again, thinking about like food or pets, you may be assuming you're getting in a native species, but sometimes some of those species look very similar. You may have a non-native hitchhiker in that shipment. Hitchhiking also encompasses a pathway that we see a lot in the Great Lakes specifically, which is some of the big cargo ships, the Laker vessels that come in the Great Lakes, use ballast water to help control their buoyancy. And that ballast water itself, because they suck up that ballast water in one port and then dump it in another port when they're unloading their cargo, that can also be a source of hitchhiking invasive species. So that I would say is probably one of the most common ways that invasive species travel, especially in this unintentional pathway. But we also have to keep in mind that there are other ways they can make it to new places. And one of those is when we as humans build connecting waterways between bodies of water that maybe previously were separate. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but that especially is a challenge with the Great Lakes, and something that we see here very, very much so in Illinois. And then kind of a final unintentional pathway is sort of nature to doing its course. So like, if there's a flooding event, you might have two bodies of water that are normally not connected, but in times of high flood, there's connections, and these aquatic invasive species can move across boundaries. So lots of different pathways means lots of different opportunities, which means lots of different ways that we have to kind of keep an eye out and prevent aquatic invasive species. And so I promised in the last slide, I'd talk a little bit more about those connecting waters, especially because it's very much an issue here in the Great Lakes in Illinois specifically. One of the most notable ways that a lot of invasive species first made it into the Great Lakes was through the creation of what's called the Welland Canal. So here on the left, you can see an image. Basically, this is right around Niagara Falls, where between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So normally Niagara Falls served as a natural barrier between those two lakes. But when we built the Welland Canal in the early 20th century, that allowed things like the sea lamprey, remember those weird looking spooky creatures at the very beginning, to come in from Lake Ontario into Lake Erie. And then from Lake Erie, they could spread into all the other lakes, Michigan, Huron, and Superior. And so while the Welland Canal was really good, it helped bring commerce. It's part of the larger St. Lawrence Seaway, so it's needed for ships to move between the ocean and the lakes. Just as ships were able to move, so were invasive species. A little bit closer to home, we have our own connecting water system. So this is the Chicago Area Waterway System, also known as CAWS, C-A-W-S. And it is essentially a series of rivers and canals from like the Chicago River, the Calumet River, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, that are all started back in the early 20th century with the need to basically reverse the flow of the Chicago River. So some of you might be familiar with the story, but essentially the city of Chicago wanted to send its waste not into Lake Michigan, where the drinking water was coming from, but to the Mississippi River. And so originally there was not much of a connection between the Mississippi River and Lake Michigan. There was sort of a natural divide. Sometimes in big flood events, you might have some exchange between the two systems, but until the creation of this waterway system, there was no direct connection between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River. Obviously, that has changed. And so now we have this connection between the two systems, which, again, great for commerce, really helps, with transportation, but it also presents some challenges when we're thinking about species that have established in Lake Michigan moving into the Mississippi River and vice versa. So CAWS will come up again in just a little bit as we talk about some specific species threatening Illinois. And so I just want to wrap up kind of this intro to aquatic invasive species by talking about why we care so much about preventing invasive species. And so the figure that you see is a little complex, but just to orient you to what you're looking at, on the left side is basically the amount of area that is being affected by an invasive species. So from like a single yard, a single pond in a single yard, all the way up to an entire river basin. Along the kind of horizontal axis, you're looking at the invasion timeline, or from like when a species is introduced until it becomes sort of established and prolific. And then on the right, it's actually the cost of managing, or the cost of doing something essentially. And so we focus a ton of our efforts, both here in Illinois and more broadly in the US, at preventing invasive species from ever getting introduced to the ecosystem. And that's really because, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. As you move across that invasion timeline, you then have to spend more and more money because you're trying to treat not only a larger area, you're trying to treat a species that has now become really entrenched. It's increased its abundance. You may have to manage more long-term. So your costs, the cost of preventing an invasive species is way smaller than a cost, and it's a lot more feasible than actually trying to get rid of a species, because at a certain point, you're not going to be able to eradicate a species. It's just going to be a game of control and sort of whack-a-mole. So shifting gears just a bit, I want to introduce you to some of the unusual suspects. Like I said, a mix of these are faces you might recognize, such as the face that only a mother lamprey could love up here in the top left-hand corner, the sea lamprey, which has this mouth full of horrifyingly odd teeth, to things like the goldfish, which you may have in your backyard, you may have in your home aquarium, to kind of lesser known things such as the zebra mussel in the top right-hand corner, which has, despite its small size, had some really huge impacts on the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And then even some species on the bottom row, like the mystery snail, the spiny water flea, and the European frogbit, that you may not have heard their names, but they may be in an ecosystem near you. You know, they could be just down the street, but you may not know about them until, you know, someday you come across like a weird looking mystery snail shell in your backyard and you're like, oh my gosh, what is this? So I have to start with the invasive carp because I know that that is, when we're talking about Illinois, that is something that is on all of our minds. You may have heard of these guys referred to kind of collectively as Asian carp. And when we say Asian carp, we're actually talking about 4 different species. We tend to try and, you know, talk about them more specifically, like instead of that Asian carp term, like actually say big head carp, silver carp, just to be a little bit more specific, because despite all of these species coming from kind of Eastern Asia, they do have very different life histories, they have different impacts, but you know, they all cause problems in their own different ways, essentially. The majority of them were brought over in, I would say the 4 species were typically brought over in the mid-20th century, so like the 1960s, 1970s, for use in actually aquaculture ponds in the southern US, so around like Arkansas. And they were really good at helping like keep these aquaculture ponds free of mussels, free of, you know, algae, because that's what the things that they eat. But the problem is, as we talked about earlier, when you have flood events, those ponds would be connected to the Mississippi River and its tributaries. And so after some really big flood events in the 1960s and 70s, they made it into the Mississippi River basin. Once they got a foothold there, it was kind of like, you know, expanding upwards. And so it was really in like the 1990s that we started to see them in Illinois. And the big kind of, you know, burst of, I would say higher abundance that people noticed came around the early 2000s. And like I mentioned earlier, the reason we typically try and refer to them each by their species is because of their different life histories. And specifically, one thing that is easy to distinguish between the 4 different species of carp is their diet. And that's kind of where they have the most impact too. So on the left-hand side, we have the silver and big head carp. And these guys are sometimes combined together because they are both really voracious plankton eaters. So plankton are these small plants and animals, microscopic, that are in the water column. And despite the large size that the silver and the big head carp can grow to, these guys love plankton. They can filter feed the water column so that there's basically no plankton left for any other native species, which is not only a problem for species of fish like adults that eat plankton, such as the paddlefish, some of the buffalo fish that we have, but so many species of juvenile fish, especially things like sport fish, perch, walleye. When they're juveniles, they really rely, like zooplankton is such a key part of their diet. So if we have these carp that are basically just consuming all of the plankton, it's not leaving a lot for juveniles, which is something that we worry about. In contrast to the silver and big head carp, the black carp, which is in Illinois, but hasn't made it quite as far towards the Great Lakes as the other two. The black carp is more of a shellfish eater. So it eats things like mollusks, snails. And the big concern with these guys is they can eat about 20% of their body weight, which again, these are big fish growing up, 30 to 40 pounds. They can eat 20% of their body weight in mussels, snails in a single day. And in the Midwest, a lot of our freshwater mussels that we have are already imperiled from a variety of reasons. Again, that pollution, loss of habitat. And so our concern is that these already imperiled native freshwater mussels are going to take another hit from the black carp if they continue to spread throughout Illinois. And then finally, our grass carp friend, perhaps unsurprisingly given its name, is a vegetarian. It eats mostly aquatic plants. And the concern there is that by eating a lot of these aquatic plants, it will actually remove habitat for other fish species. So a lot of fish rely on kind of submerged vegetation to not only provide food, but to provide shelter from other predators. And so without having this vegetation, you're just going to have like a muddy mess of a pond or a lake. So, like I said, all harmful, but all in their own unique, special ways. And the question I always get, like 9 times out of 10 when I'm talking to people about carp is, are they going to make it to Lake Michigan? And the question is, I guess the answer is, we're really hoping not. And we're putting a lot of money and effort into preventing them from making it from the Illinois River, which they're established, very prolific, through that cause system, the Chicago area waterway system. And one tool that's in place, managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, is an electric barrier right around Romeoville. And the idea behind it is essentially, if you have like an invisible fence for your dog, it's the same concept, that at the bottom of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal in this location, there is electrodes that put a current in the water that is basically gives the fish a shock. And so this shock dissuades them from swimming upstream into Lake Michigan. And it has done a good job. We found that it's better at dissuading larger fish than it is smaller fish. Smaller fish don't seem to be as affected by the electricity. And so that is one tool that we have in place right now that's currently working. If you're familiar with the area, you may have heard about the Brandon Road Lock and Dam project, which has been kind of this long simmering effort where they, a little bit further downstream of the electric barrier, they would like to basically build this kind of multi-layered prevention system. So it wouldn't just be electricity or like one technique. It would be multiple techniques, such as like the use of carbon dioxide. I think there's the idea that they might be some acoustics or like using sound to deter them, but it would be multiples of that to be kind of like like if they get through one, they won't get through another. And that is something that is still under construction, but that's, if you've heard of the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, that's kind of, we're hoping to have a more layered approach to preventing them from moving further upstream, so they hopefully will not make it into Lake Michigan. And I just want to take a quick minute to talk about one species of invasive carp in particular that you may have seen videos of, and that is the silver carp. So again, these are the guys, one of the guys that eat plankton. These guys have probably more, like there's more of these guys in the Illinois River than any other species of fish. And they are very notable for one particular thing, and that is their ability to just jump like crazy out of the water. So you may have seen pictures of people like with nets, catching them, jumping out of the water, them jumping out of the water, hitting people in the face. If I tempt fate here, I may show a video of essentially what happens with these guys is when there's any disturbance, such as a boat motor, different noises, they will jump out of the water en masse in just these really crazy displays. So I have to always show the craziness of it, but it can be really impressive. This is particularly like kind of Kentucky, southern Illinois, but we're seeing that in the Illinois River as well. And one of the insidious things about the silver carp is when they are young, they look super, super similar to some of our native bait species. So the image you see up here, there are 4 fish that are native and 2 that are silver carp. And if you didn't know any better, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is all the same fish. But the 2 on the right-hand side are silver carp. The other 4 are native shad species. And so this just kind of goes to one message, which is when you're thinking about moving bait, there can be mistaken identities. And so the Asian carp, such as silver carp, can sometimes look a lot like your bait. So just something to be on the alert for. And then just to wrap up with the carp, not to carp on it, but you may have also seen in the last year, the Illinois DNR started this new campaign to rebrand silver and bighead carp as copy, a play on the word copious, to hopefully encourage people to eat invasive carp. And I've had it. It is good. It's kind of like a white, flaky white fish. I would say not dissimilar to like tilapia. It kind of tastes like whatever you cook it as. And it is potentially a way that we could take out some of the fish and use them for a source of protein. So I would encourage you, if you see copia on the menu, it might be worth a try. And there are ways. I know for those of you who fish, one of the challenges is it has a lot of bones, but there are some really great videos on YouTube that kind of help you figure out how you can fillet to get around all those small bones. So I'm just going to run through a couple more of species you may have heard of, you may have not, just to talk about things that, some of the effects that they're having across the state. And so I mentioned Phragmites earlier, which is this common reed. Phragmites is a little weird because there was originally a native Phragmites species, but 9 times out of 10, the Phragmites you see now is invasive. And it was introduced on the East Coast actually back in the 1800s, but it's over the last 200 years, it's spread inland, or spread from the East Coast to the Midwest. And Phragmites is a pain in the butt to manage and also just to deal with. If you own like any lakefront or waterfront property, it can block your views. It also is just really terrible for plants or for other animals because it forms, as you can kind of see, these dense monocultures that just like don't provide really great habitat for anything like birds or fish. And so as a wetland ecologist, as I mentioned earlier, Phragmites is sort of the bane of my existence. but it's also the bane of a lot of, other animals' existence as well. So I don't feel quite as alone there. Zebra and quagga mussels are a unique case. These are a non-native mussel that came over from kind of the Eurasian area back in like the 1990s. They were brought over in the ballast water of those cargo ships, as I sort of mentioned earlier. And you would not know. So they have kind of small size. These guys are maybe, 1 or 2 inches long at max, but they have totally rewritten the story of the Great Lakes in the last 30 years. And the zebra, I include them both together, zebra and quagga, because they are very closely related kind of species, and they have had a lot of the same impacts. And both are in the Great Lakes. The zebra mussel has made it a little bit further into the Mississippi River. Quagga mussel's probably not far behind, though. And I didn't want to show too many like data heavy figures, but I think this one's interesting because the zebra mussels were really the first winners when they made it to the Great Lakes. So this is an image of Lake Michigan at 4 different time periods. So the early 90s, when the mussels were just starting to get established and spread, 2000 when they were making it further, 2005, and then 2010. So about a 15-year period. And the zebra mussels, they got there, they spread really far. They were almost covering all the nearshore areas of Lake Michigan. If you went to the beach, you're probably familiar with their shells that cut your feet open. But in contrast, it's actually like the zebra mussels have not been doing as good lately. The quagga mussels kind of took over and outcompeted the original invasive species. So we talked about invasive species outcompeting natives. Invasives can even outcompete other invasives sometimes. So now in Lake Michigan, most of the invasive mussels we have are quagga mussels. And it's not like an enemy of the enemy is my friend type thing. Both of these mussels have really damaged the food web because, like those invasive carp, they eat plankton, they're filter feeders, and they've really just taken all the plankton out of Lake Michigan. That's part of the reason the lake is so clear. There's just nothing in the water column, which means that a lot of fish don't have something to eat. They also are a problem, when we're thinking about industry, if, they basically just form wherever there's a hard surface. So a lot of pipes can get clogged. This is showing kind of the cross section of a pipe filled with zebra mussels. They can gum up works that cost a lot of money to treat with. And they've even been implicated in some mass bird die-offs that we've seen of like water birds, because they essentially are a harbor for the bacteria that causes avian botulism. And so they kind of start this domino effect where it leads up to these birds having these mass die-offs that we've had at least a couple in the last 5 to 10 years along beaches in the Great Lakes area that have been kind of as a result of the zebra and quagga mussels. I had to include red swamp crayfish, not only because of their tastiness, but also because they are an interesting case where we have native populations of red swamp crayfish at the very southern part of the state. But in the Chicagoland area, they are considered invasive. So that's even like across the state, you can have species that are native to one region, but invasive in another. And the red swamp crayfish, its challenge is because it is a tasty food item, it's used as a pet in like school classrooms, and can sometimes unfortunately get released. The challenge with these guys is they're super hardy, so like they can get released in Chicago area waterways and not blink an eye. They also outcompete some of our native crayfish species. And one thing in particular here is on the right, you can see these guys make burrows into the sides of like rivers and streams, and their burrow systems can be so extensive that it actually leads to stream bank erosion, which can cause a lot of issues, especially if you happen to own that stream and the land is subsiding. And then there's always more troublemakers on the to be on the watch for. So these are just literally 4 of many species that are on what we consider watch lists. So there are species that different Great Lakes states have regulations on, trying to prohibit their spread. These are all ones such as, hydrilla, water hyacinth, that may have been seen sporadically but aren't considered established. That is, they don't have a reproducing population in our area yet. There's also some species like the tench, which is the fish at the bottom right-hand corner, that are in some areas of the Great Lakes, but not in Lake Michigan yet. So it's really like, I said earlier, the game of whack-a-mole, but it is always the need to be alert and to have consideration for, what might be the next species that gains a foothold in either the Great Lakes or the Mississippi River Basin, and try and get ahead of that. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, that ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure when it comes to dealing with invasive species. And if we can prevent them from getting that foothold, that will save us not only a lot of heartbreak in the future, but a lot of money and resources as well. And so I just want to kind of end on a happier note. It seems like this fight is always ongoing, but what work is being done in and around Illinois to try and prevent the damages from AIS. And so I'll speak specifically a little bit about the organization I'm with, which is Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. And we do a lot of work both on the research side of things about AIS as well as outreach. And so with research, we typically fund scientists at universities across the state to help not only understand how invasive species get to new water bodies, but what are their impacts when they get there. And then we do a lot of outreach where we not only create materials like this poster about the differences between bighead and silver carp, talking with bait shops, talking with aquarium shops. We also try and coordinate work among groups of researchers, industry folks, federal and state agencies, tribal groups, just to make sure the right people are talking to one another, and that we're having not only the people who are working on the issues talking about it, but having the people who are affected by the issues. So the landowners, the people who are, make their living fishing, trying to bring all of those voices to the table to come up with solutions to these really complex challenges that AIS pose. And so I just want to show like one very quick example of some research that we funded through Sea Grant to a researcher at Loyola University Chicago, Dr. Rebrand Carp, whose group was actually looking at the barrier I talked about earlier, the electric barrier on the Chicago area waterway system, that its main purpose is to keep the carp out, but Dr. Keller's lab was also trying to figure out, would that electric barrier keep invasive invertebrates out? So again, these are things like snails, clams, the crayfish. And they actually found that while the electric barrier was really good at keeping the fish out, it wasn't really great at keeping the invertebrates out. So when we're thinking about, how invertebrates move between the Mississippi River and Lake Michigan, the electric barrier may not be the most effective way of preventing that. So that's just one example of Sea Grant funded research that's helped us better understand how we can put these things into management tools that can be useful. And so at this point, you're probably like, oh my gosh, invasive species, what do I do? But there are definitely ways that you yourself or, people you talk with, can definitely help. This is a big problem, and so it kind of requires all hands on deck. And so one of the biggest things you can do is, if you are going out to the lake, going out to your local river, making sure that before you would take your equipment to another body of water, say, you go to one pond on Saturday, next day you're going up to the lake, just to make sure that you clean, drain, and dry all of your equipment. And so some places, depending on the water body you're at, may have a cleaning station that they will let you use to wipe down your boat. Just making sure that you don't have like visible pieces of aquatic vegetation attached. If you have any live wells, making sure that that's drained really well. The gold standard is actually like allowing your boat or other equipment to dry in the sun for like 5 days. We know that's not always feasible, so that's why, making sure you could clean or drain in the meantime is really important. Because again, some of those larvae can live for a couple days even without water. And we just want to make sure that we're not potentially moving something from one water body that might have established species to another body of water that doesn't. For those of you who like water gardens, really thinking about making sure that you're choosing native species where you can. This kind of goes without saying, but there are some really great alternatives that are native that you don't necessarily have to worry about. Is this a species that, say, I get like a big flood event, or its seeds might be transported by a bird that could potentially spread? And then kind of on a final note, making sure that you don't release any pets, any bait that you have left over after a day of fishing, because they can, sometimes they will die, but sometimes they will survive and then lead to some establishment and some major harm. So just always remembering that don't dump your pets or bait at the end of a day. So I will leave you with our campaign brand that Sea Grant talks about, which is, be a hero, transport zero. So, you playing your role as not transporting aquatic invasive species to new places. We have a website that you can check out for more info. Another resource that I really recommend is called Glances, which is this Great Lakes Aquatic Nuisance Species information system, which is a mouthful, but it's a really great database of basically every invasive species in the Great Lakes, as well as some, kind of watch list species that, you might want to look for. They've got lots of pictures, lots of additional resources you can look to, but it's a really great way to get to know some of the species, and if you're trying to identify something. And then finally, if you have interest in anything Sea Grant's working on, you can always check out our Illinois, Indiana Sea Grant webpage at iisg.org. And I hope I have some time for some questions, but if you would like to contact me afterwards, I have my email address, and I don't know, Chris might be able to share that as well. But with that, I will thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.